Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. Have you ever thought to yourself, how did modern cities get to be the way they are? Or have you ever thought, man, cities have a lot of problems. Where did they come from? Well, stick around because that's what we're going to tackle today on Mr. E's Classroom. Hey guys, welcome to Mr. E's Classroom. The question we're going to take a look at today is what led to the birth of the modern city and what problems were created by urbanization. Let's start out by defining that word, urbanization. Urbanization just refers to the growth of cities in size and population. So what would lead people to want to move to cities at the turn of the 20th century? There's really three answers to that. Number one is jobs, especially for women and immigrants. Number two is the new opportunities that were available in cities that weren't available out in the rural areas. And the third reason is simply excitement. Cities were a lot more exciting than being out in the country. So how fast were cities growing at the turn of the 20th century? Well, take a look at this chart and it really will help answer that question. When you look at the major cities of the United States, you can see just how fast they grew from the 1860s, just after the Civil War, to the turn of the 20th century. I mean, just look at Chicago. It went from a sleepy town of 100,000 people to over 1.5 million people in just about 40 years. That's a huge explosion of population. People were flocking to cities. So what exactly caused such a rapid urbanization? Well, number one, it was the new immigrants that settled in these cities. Cities offered unskilled jobs, really cheap housing, and it made for a lot easier transition to the American way of life. Another reason for such rapid urbanization was farmers were fleeing rural areas. A lot of farmers after the Civil War had a lot of debt to deal with. Most farmers were searching a steady paycheck. Basically, that just meant a factory job, and the city was the only place to find one of those. A third reason for this rapid urbanization is an African American migration. After the Civil War, a lot of African Americans left the South. They headed for cities in the North. A lot of them were simply just trying to escape racial violence and economic hardship. They thought cities offered kind of a new start for them. So along with these growing cities, there are a lot of new ideas that come into play. Around this time, you start to see the first skyscrapers. Back then, a skyscraper was pretty much any building that had more than 10 stories to it. It was a lot easier to expand a city upward than it was to go outward. A lot of this was made possible by an invention by a guy named Elijah Otis, the Otis safety elevator. Think about it. Would you want to have to climb 8 or 10 flights of steps every time you went into a building? The Otis elevator was a safe way to get up high and not have to climb all those steps. Another new big idea was this idea of mass transit or public transportation systems. These mass transit systems could get people around pretty quickly and fairly inexpensively. You had things like underground subways, electric streetcars, and in some cities like Chicago, they even elevated trains. Another big idea that comes out of this growth of cities is the idea of city planning. City planning really made cities safer, more functional, and even added a little bit of beauty. Have you ever heard of a place called Central Park? A big giant park right in the middle of New York City? That was designed by a guy named Frederick Olmsted. Central Park kind of became a model for just about all major cities. They said, hey, let's add in some natural areas into our city to try to make people just a little bit more happy. With all these people that were rushing into the cities, there needed to be a place for them to stay. This is where we get tenement houses. Tenement houses are basically just apartment-style buildings that were designed to fit as many families as possible in them. Tenement houses often had some serious problems. Here's a great example of a tenement house. A lot of times, tenement houses were really unsafe and really unsanitary, but they were also incredibly cheap to be able to rent an apartment in. Let's take a quick look and do some exploration around some tenement houses. This is what your standard tenement room would look like. They weren't very big at all. And you'd try to fit as many people into one room as possible because that's what made rent pretty cheap. This is the kind of kitchen you'd have if you lived at a tenement house. Looks like a place where you could make a fine gourmet meal to me. If you were lucky, you lived in a tenement house that had some sort of basic laundry facility like this right here. You remember how I said tenement houses were relatively cheap, but the trade-off was they were unsafe and unsanitary? Well, this is your basic tenement house right here. Doesn't it really have some fantastic curb appeal? If you were really lucky, you lived in a tenement house that had some space where children could play, just like this one right here. Do you notice what it says down in the bottom corner? Do you notice what's missing from this picture? Some of these tenement houses really had some serious problems. Around the turn of the 20th century, a guy named Jacob Riis wrote this book right here, How the Other Half Lives. Riis went around and basically documented the living conditions of a lot of tenement families. What he showed through his photographs really showed some pretty deplorable conditions that families had to live in these buildings. Here are just a few examples. If you needed a place to sleep, hey, why not do it on the grate outside the building? Anybody want to take a guess as to what that big pile right in the middle of the picture is? I'll give you a hint. Probably didn't come from animals. Here's another great picture. Or what about this picture right here? I'm not even sure how to caption this. Anybody have a suggestion? Do those really look like conditions that you would want to have to live in if you moved to a city? Along with this rapid growth of cities, there were also some serious problems that started to develop. Sanitation was one of the big ones. At the end of the 1800s, cities were just absolutely filthy places. Most cities had some pretty poor and outdated sewer systems that really weren't designed to handle that many people. There's also a very limited amount of clean water to use. Around the turn of the 20th century, the life expectancy of a person living in a major city was only about 43 years old. The other major problem that was happening in urban areas was overcrowding. Think about what happens when you get too many people in a confined space. Number one is there's a ton of crime. At this time in major cities, crime was everywhere. It was a major issue that had to be dealt with. Another big issue was fires. A lot of buildings wind up catching on fire because pretty much every building out there was a major fire hazard. Large cities really had to develop large police departments and large fire departments to deal with all this. That pretty much sums up why cities grew so fast at the turn of the 20th century and what people had to deal with. Here are a couple of takeaways. Number one, around the turn of the 20th century, remember that people were flocking to major cities. Number two, new ideas like skyscrapers, mass transit, and even city planning were really needed to deal with urbanization. And lastly, the conditions of cities weren't the best and actually wound up leading to some serious problems. Ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you were paying attention and got some great notes out of this. Always be ready for that quiz that may happen when we're in class next time. And as I always say, guys, remember, don't ever stop learning.